Lady Morgana was a figure who inspired both admiration and fear, a woman whose beauty and poise masked a labyrinth of secrets darker than anyone dared to imagine. She belonged to an aristocratic lineage whose roots stretched back centuries, their estates sprawling across the misty hills and forests of the region. Tales of her ancestors were woven into the fabric of local legend. Some praised their refinement and influence, while others whispered of curses, sudden deaths, and shadowed deeds that stained their history. Morgana inherited not only the family wealth but also its reputation, a dual legacy that would define the trajectory of her life. From the moment she appeared in society, she exuded an air of unshakable confidence. Her presence commanded attention in every room she entered, yet there was always an unsettling edge to her charm. Servants spoke of her sharp gaze that seemed to see through masks. Nobles speculated about the unusual guests she favored, and townsfolk nervously recounted fleeting encounters that hinted at her unpredictable temperament. Every public appearance was meticulously staged. Her gowns were elaborate, her jewelry sparkling under candlelight, and her every word measured for maximum impact. Yet behind this meticulous veneer, there was a private world that few penetrated, a world where rumors whispered of obsession, cruelty, and hidden indulgences that defied the moral codes of the time. The manor itself reflected her complex personality. Perched atop a solitary hill and surrounded by twisted, ancient trees, it appeared from a distance both majestic and foreboding. Its stone walls were etched with centuries of weathering, while windows cast reflective glimmers in the moonlight, giving the impression that the building itself was watching intruders. Inside, hallways stretched in labyrinthine patterns, adorned with faded tapestries depicting scenes of hunting, feasts, and victories long past. Chandeliers hung heavy with crystal, their light refracting in shadows that seemed to move independently, as though the manor had a life of its own. It was said that the arrangement of rooms, the placement of mirrors, and even the slight creaking of floors were designed deliberately, not merely for grandeur, but to unsettle visitors, reminding them of the subtle power she wielded. Guests often arrived feeling flattered and intrigued, yet by the end of a short stay, many left with an ineffable unease, an impression that they had glimpsed a world they were not meant to see. The manor became more than a home. It was an extension of Lady Morgana herself, a physical embodiment of her mystique and the darkness that seemed to follow her. Her upbringing contributed greatly to her enigmatic nature. Born to a mother who was known for her sharp intellect and a father whose temper could alternately charm and terrify, Morgana was trained from an early age to navigate both admiration and fear with equal finesse. Tutors in languages, etiquette, history, and the arts ensured that she could converse fluently with the most learned minds, while servants were tasked with teaching her the subtle art of influence. But alongside refinement, there were lessons in power and control that were far less benign. She learned to read expressions, discern lies, and exploit weaknesses, skills that would later allow her to manipulate not only the upper echelons of society, but also those closest to her. Her childhood was punctuated by whispered warnings and cryptic lessons, many of which hinted at an obsession with dominance and secrecy. By the time she reached adulthood, Morgana had become a woman who could effortlessly command a room, seduce attention, and simultaneously provoke fear, a combination that both fascinated and repelled her contemporaries. It was her reputation for eccentricity that most intrigued the public. She maintained peculiar routines and favored guests whose presence served her own hidden purposes. Servants noted her fascination with the interplay of light and shadow, particularly during candlelit evenings, when she would wander the manor in silence, sometimes speaking to no one, at other times holding conversations with voices that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. Her garden, meticulously cultivated yet shadowed by twisted branches, contained hidden paths and alcoves that only she knew. Flowers bloomed in strange patterns, chosen not just for beauty but for their symbolic meanings, signaling messages to those who understood, or believed they understood, their significance. Superstitions clung to her like a second skin. Some claimed she dabbled in forbidden rituals, others whispered of poisons kept in vials hidden behind false panels. The truth, as with much of Morgana's life, was obscured by layers of deliberate mystique. Those who tried to peer too closely into her private world often found themselves unnerved or disoriented, their curiosity giving way to fear. Her relationships were equally complex and carefully curated. She moved among the elite with grace, yet always with a strategic mind, selecting acquaintances and allies not merely for affection but for advantage. Some admired her intellect, others feared her influence, and a few outright despised her for the unsettling charisma she wielded. Tales of rivals vanishing from social circles, sudden illnesses, and inexplicable accidents began to circulate, though none could be definitively traced to her. Yet in the minds of many, these stories painted a portrait of a woman who existed between reality and legend, a figure both alluring and dangerous. Even those closest to her often found themselves second-guessing their impressions, unsure whether their hostess was capricious, malicious, or merely enigmatic. Historical context deepens the fascination with Lady Morgana. The era was one of rigid class structures, secret alliances, and unspoken codes of conduct. Aristocrats such as Morgana were expected to maintain appearances of refinement, honor, and decorum, yet behind closed doors, intrigue, deception, and manipulation were the currency of power. Banquets, dances, and gatherings were stages upon which influence could be exerted, reputations crafted, and enemies undermined. Within this environment, Lady Morgana thrived. Her ability to blend charm, intimidation, and psychological insight allowed her to navigate a treacherous social landscape with an almost preternatural skill. She became not just a participant in society, but a manipulator of it, her actions leaving ripples that would later magnify the horror of the events she orchestrated. By the time she prepared for the fateful feast that would etch her name into history, Lady Morgana had perfected the art of concealment. Her manner, her demeanor, and even her invitations were carefully calculated to draw others into her orbit, ensuring that every guest was unaware of the danger lurking beneath the veneer of civility. Shadows lengthened in her corridors, mirrors reflected more than appearances, and the faintest sounds in the halls hinted at secrets the world was not yet ready to confront. To the outside observer, she remained an enigmatic aristocrat, the perfect hostess. To those who would soon meet their fate within the walls of her candlelit hall, she was a master of a macabre game whose rules were known only to her. And thus, the stage was set, the players unaware, as the story of Lady Morgana's forbidden feast began to unfurl in darkness, suspense, and the promise of horror that would haunt history forever. The invitations themselves were a study in elegance and forewarning, delicate parchment embossed with gold filigree and sealed with Lady Morgana's personal crest, a crescent moon intertwined with a serpent. Each envelope carried an aura of prestige, a promise of an evening of refinement and indulgence, yet hidden beneath the allure was a subtle weight that hinted at the unknown. Recipients, upon receiving their letters, were immediately flattered. To be invited to a feast by such a figure was a mark of distinction, a signal of trust and favor. Some read the call to the banquet with excitement, picturing themselves among the elite, rubbing elbows with those of equal rank and influence. Others, however, could not shake a faint sense of unease, an inexplicable prickling at the back of the mind that whispered caution. There was something about the invitations, their precise wording and deliberate formality, that suggested the occasion was unlike any other. Yet most dismissed such thoughts, for fear of questioning Lady Morgana's intentions could be considered an insult in a society so governed by etiquette and appearance. The guests chosen were no accident. Each had a story, a weakness, a position that could be manipulated or observed. Some were allies, others rivals, and a select few had past transgressions that only Lady Morgana knew. Nobles, merchants, scholars, and a scattering of artists and musicians composed the list, a cross-section of influence and ambition. To the casual observer, the gathering appeared as a celebration of culture and refinement, but Morgana's selections were strategic. The inclusion of certain individuals ensured tension in the room, an undercurrent of unspoken rivalries that would bubble to the surface under the watchful eye of the hostess. Guests were, unknowingly, pieces on a chessboard, each move carefully considered, each interaction a potential revelation of character or weakness. The preparation for the evening extended beyond mere invitations. Servants were instructed with meticulous precision, curtains drawn at exact angles, candles positioned to cast both beauty and shadow, and rooms arranged to guide conversation and observation. Lady Morgana's knowledge of human behavior bordered on uncanny. She understood how to provoke desire, fear, curiosity, or envy with a simple gesture or comment. Even the timing of arrivals was controlled, each guest entering in a sequence that allowed her to observe reactions, to measure anticipation, and perhaps to set the stage for subtle psychological manipulation. There was an artistry to the way she orchestrated these moments, a careful interplay of light, sound, and social tension that transformed a simple gathering into a study of human nature under pressure. Letters arrived by courier, and the act of delivering them was itself a ritual. Couriers were sworn to secrecy, warned of the gravity of their task, and instructed to watch carefully for reactions. Some recipients were immediately intrigued, others wary. One young count, reading the invitation in the dim glow of his study, felt a shiver of apprehension as he imagined the vast hall and the enigmatic woman who had summoned him there. A scholar pondered the symbolic imagery on the crest, noting the serpent's gaze as if it were alive, silently judging. A merchant imagined the opulent feast, the music, and the conversations that might grant him influence or opportunity. The letters were innocent in appearance, yet each contained an invisible thread leading inexorably toward the evening that would change the lives of everyone involved. The social climate of the time amplified the significance of such an invitation. In an era governed by reputation, privilege, and strict adherence to protocol, declining an invitation could be a perilous act, interpreted as a slight or a threat to one's standing. Thus, even those who sensed danger felt compelled to attend, caught in the invisible net of social expectation. The dichotomy of desire and fear, flattery and apprehension, created a tension that Lady Morgana understood instinctively. She exploited it, knowing that the anticipation and unease would heighten the senses, making her guests both vulnerable and attentive, eager to please, yet subtly off balance. Every interaction, every glance, every whispered conversation would later become a puzzle piece in the larger tableau of horror. There were also whispered warnings. Servants in nearby estates spoke in hushed tones of strange sightings near the manor, of shadows that moved without light, and of sounds in the night that suggested hidden passageways and secret chambers. Gossip among the local populace hinted at prior feasts gone awry, though none could provide concrete evidence. Some speculated that Morgana practiced occult rituals. Others suggested a fascination with poisons and psychological manipulation. These stories, half-truths and fabrications, contributed to the aura surrounding her invitation. For those attending, whether they believed the rumors or not, a sense of apprehension mingled with excitement, creating a perfect storm of emotions that Lady Morgana would use to her advantage. The imagery of the banquet was itself carefully hinted at in the invitation. Phrases suggesting candlelit elegance, rare wines, and exotic delicacies painted a picture of indulgence and refinement, yet the diction contained subtle cues of control and expectation. Every word was deliberate, every flourish of the calligraphy a calculated part of the psychological landscape. Guests were drawn not just by curiosity, but by the irresistible human desire to witness and participate in what was forbidden, the allure of entering a world where rules could bend and danger could masquerade as pleasure. They arrived expecting celebration, unaware that the true nature of the evening would be far more sinister. By the night of the feast, the manor had transformed into a stage ready for its audience. The invitations had done their work. The guests were in place, their minds preoccupied with anticipation, social rivalry, and the subtle thrill of curiosity. Lady Morgana, meanwhile, moved among her preparations like a conductor orchestrating a complex symphony, aware of the power she held over each individual who would step through her doors. The anticipation was thick, a tangible presence that lingered in the corridors, the hallways, and the flickering candlelight. What seemed like courtesy, refinement, and hospitality was, in truth, a carefully constructed trap, a convergence of planning, observation, and subtle menace. Each guest, by accepting the invitation, had unwittingly agreed to participate in a game whose rules were known only to the hostess. A game that would soon reveal the darkness that had long been whispered behind closed doors. The stage was set. The invitations had fulfilled their purpose, luring nobles and scholars, merchants and artists, into a world that was as captivating as it was dangerous. Anticipation and unease intertwined, creating a perfect environment for suspense to escalate. Lady Morgana, silent and watchful, awaited the arrival of her guests, fully aware that the evening's events would forever imprint themselves upon history, their echoes resonating in whispers long after the final candle had been extinguished. The dinner that promised elegance and indulgence would instead become a prelude to terror in every detail. From the carefully chosen invitees to the deliberate phrasing of the letters, had been designed to ensure that no one would leave the manor unchanged. The manor was alive with an almost imperceptible tension as the guests arrived one by one, each footstep echoing along the polished stone floors of the grand entrance hall. Lady Morgana awaited them at the top of the sweeping staircase, her presence commanding yet unsettling, a perfect combination of elegance and menace. Candlelight flickered across her features, highlighting the sharp angles of her face and the cold glint in her eyes, and as each guest ascended the stairs, they were greeted with a smile that seemed both warm and calculating, an invitation layered with subtle intimidation. The grand hall itself was a spectacle, designed to impress and disorient simultaneously. Long tables, polished to a reflective sheen, were draped with crimson cloths, while golden candelabras cast dancing shadows that twisted along the walls, creating shapes that seemed almost alive. Tapestries depicting scenes of hunting, victory, and ancient rituals lined the room, their details exaggerated by the wavering candlelight, lending the space an atmosphere of reverence and unease. The guests, dressed in their finest attire, exchanged polite greetings, their voices hushed as though even speaking too loudly might disrupt an invisible tension in the air. Nobles and merchants, scholars and artists, each carried a mix of curiosity and apprehension, unaware that every gesture and whispered word was being observed and weighed by the hostess. Lady Morgana moved among them with a fluid grace, her eyes flickering with an intensity that suggested she saw more than just faces. She read intentions, desires, and fears. Even those accustomed to courtly intrigue felt a chill in her presence, as though the very walls of the manor conspired to magnify her authority. The careful placement of guests along the tables ensured that rivalries simmered just beneath the surface. Allies were separated by opponents. Conversation sparked subtly by veiled comments, and tension mounted as each individual navigated the complex web of social interaction orchestrated by Morgana. The feast began with delicate hors d'oeuvres, each dish a masterpiece in both presentation and selection. Exquisite aromas wafted through the hall, combining scents of rare spices, roasted meats, and sweet pastries that captivated the senses. Yet the food was more than sustenance. It was a tool, a means of subtle manipulation. The placement of dishes, the timing of service, and the careful observation of guests' reactions allowed Morgana to study her companions with almost surgical precision. A slight hesitation in one guest's bite, a nervous glance from another, a whispered compliment overheard at just the right moment. All were noted and catalogued, part of the invisible architecture of control she maintained. Conversations were light yet loaded with subtext, polite yet charged, and with each passing hour, the air seemed to thicken, carrying an unspoken promise of something far darker than a mere banquet. Music, soft and haunting, floated through the hall, played by a small ensemble tucked discreetly into a corner. The notes seemed to echo and elongate in the cavernous space, their tones heightening the senses, drawing attention to shadowed alcoves and glimmering reflections in the polished silverware. It was an atmosphere carefully calibrated to elicit fascination and unease simultaneously. Lady Morgana herself did not eat as the others did. Instead, she observed, moving from guest to guest with purpose, her expressions shifting subtly, sometimes a benign smile, sometimes a thin-lipped look that caused the most confident to falter. The interplay of light and shadow on her face mirrored the duality of her intentions, hospitality and menace, charm and threat. Every glance, every gesture was a message, a test, and the guests, oblivious to the game, complied with the etiquette of fear and admiration. Whispers of old rumors lingered in the minds of a few perceptive attendees. Tales of previous gatherings where guests left with unease, of small accidents that had seemed harmless but were never explained, drifted like ghosts in the corners of their consciousness. Some laughed off the stories, attributing them to superstition or jealousy, yet the faintest crack of candle wax or the slightest creak in the floorboards reminded them of the fragility of their surroundings. The manor, its ancient walls, and its labyrinthine corridors became participants in the evening, amplifying the tension and lending weight to Morgana's subtle manipulations. The guests, unaware, were walking deeper into a psychological landscape carefully constructed to unsettle, distract, and ultimately disarm them. The courses grew more elaborate as the feast progressed. Main dishes arrived, sculpted and seasoned with an artistry that distracted from the mounting unease. Conversation, laughter, and polite chatter masked the subtle terror taking root in the room. Lady Morgana moved among the guests, her presence both magnetic and disquieting. She inquired about families, lands, and achievements, yet her questions carried a probing quality, each answer dissected for weaknesses, secrets, or potential leverage. Even the most confident nobles felt their composure tested, as though every word spoken might reveal a flaw that could later be exploited. The feast was no longer a simple gathering. It had become a meticulous study of human behavior, a controlled environment in which observation, manipulation, and tension reigned supreme. At intervals, she summoned attention with subtle gestures, drawing certain guests into closer scrutiny. A brief toast, a meaningful glance, a passing comment about loyalty or betrayal, all heightened the psychological stakes. The interplay between fear and admiration intensified, and even those who considered themselves astute began to feel the creeping sense that the night held consequences far beyond mere etiquette. Candlelight shadows lengthened, reflecting faces in ways that were almost sinister, and the room seemed to pulse with the anticipation of an unseen climax. Every detail, from the placement of chairs to the sequence of dishes, was deliberate, ensuring that the guests, whether they realized it or not, were being guided into a state of vulnerability and heightened awareness. As dessert was served, the true weight of the evening began to press upon the attendees. The hall, beautiful yet oppressive, was a theater of subtle dread, and Lady Morgana's performance as hostess had achieved its purpose. The guests were enthralled, anxious, and unprepared for the darker events yet to unfold. Shadows flickered across faces, voices carried the undercurrent of tension, and the once celebratory atmosphere had transformed into a charged, almost electric sense of foreboding. The forbidden feast had fully unfolded, revealing itself as a stage for psychological observation, manipulation, and the first hints of terror that would soon escalate into something far more sinister than any of them could have imagined. The candlelit hall, which had once radiated elegance and refinement, became a stage of chaos and terror as the night descended into horror. The gentle flicker of flames now cast monstrous shadows across the walls, elongating faces into grotesque masks of fear and disbelief. A single scream cut through the orchestrated murmur of conversation, sudden and raw, snapping the fragile veil of composure that the guests had maintained for hours. Panic rippled through the hall like a contagion. Some stumbled over chairs, others clutched their garments in desperate attempts to shield themselves from a danger they could not yet identify. Lady Morgana remained in the center of the room, an unsettling calm on her face, observing every reaction as though she were watching a performance she had choreographed herself. The contrast between her composure and the frantic movements of the guests heightened the surreal and terrifying nature of the moment, leaving no one able to distinguish between reality and the carefully manipulated fear that had been building throughout the evening. The method of the massacre was horrifying in its precision, calculated to maximize panic and confusion. Guests were found in grotesque positions, some slumped over the opulent tables still adorned with half-eaten food, others sprawled across the polished floors, faces frozen in expressions of disbelief, shock, and pain. Shadows danced across the walls, magnifying the scene of carnage, and the faint sound of dripping liquid echoed through the vast space, punctuating the silence that followed the initial outcry. Those who survived the first moments of terror scrambled toward doors and windows, only to find them locked, bolted, or otherwise obstructed, as if the manor itself had conspired to ensure no one could escape. The very architecture that had once impressed with grandeur now trapped them in a nightmare carefully crafted by the hostess, whose motives remained as inscrutable as ever. The chaos was punctuated by the flickering of candlelight across sharp edges, shattered glass, and overturned chairs. The intoxicating scent of the feast, once delightful, now mingled with something far more sinister. The coppery tang of blood, the acrid odor of wax and smoke, and the lingering, almost imperceptible perfume of Lady Morgana herself. Each step taken across the hall seemed to echo endlessly, amplifying the guests' terror and magnifying their awareness of the impending doom. Whispers and cries intermingled with the ambient noises of a grand hall that had become a chamber of horror, creating an almost unbearable auditory tension. Every corner held the potential for further discovery, each shadow a possible threat, and every fleeting sound a reminder that the boundaries between predator and prey had irrevocably shifted. Witnesses later described the scene with a mixture of disbelief and horror, struggling to reconcile the opulence of the setting with the brutality of the acts that had occurred. The chandeliers, heavy with crystal, reflected the chaos in fractured prisms, scattering light and shadow in ways that seemed almost surreal, as if the room itself had become an accomplice in the unfolding terror. Lady Morgana, always observant, used these elements to further disorient and dominate her guests psychologically, ensuring that fear was not merely physical but deeply internalized. The human mind, when confronted with such deliberate and meticulous horror, falters, and Morgana's careful orchestration had ensured that every guest experienced this breakdown. Amid the panic, small details painted a portrait of calculated cruelty. Certain guests were targeted first, their positions and actions seemingly premeditated to instill maximum fear in those who witnessed them. Others were left in moments of ambiguity, appearing unharmed at first glance, only for the true horror to reveal itself in the following minutes. Lady Morgana's understanding of human psychology was evident. Terror was heightened by uncertainty, by the slow unraveling of security and trust. The interplay of light, shadow, sound, and physical threat was designed not merely to kill, but to ensure that the psychological impact would linger, haunting survivors and witnesses indefinitely. The hall echoed with cries, whispers, and the sound of hurried steps as survivors attempted to comprehend the magnitude of what had transpired. Some clung to each other in desperate attempts to find comfort, while others froze, paralyzed by shock. The feast, meant to be a celebration of refinement and social power, had transformed into a tableau of unimaginable horror, where every element, food, furniture, lighting, and human behavior, had been exploited to devastating effect. Lady Morgana's presence at the center of this storm, calm and almost regal, magnified the terror, transforming her from a mere hostess into a figure of almost mythic malevolence. As the night wore on, it became clear that the events were not random. Each death, each act of panic, seemed to follow a deliberate pattern, as if the entire banquet had been a performance in which Lady Morgana controlled every scene, every reaction, and every outcome. By the time the dawn approached, the manor was a chilling monument to her orchestration, a place where beauty and horror had collided with catastrophic precision. Witnesses would later recount the haunting silence that settled after the initial chaos, a silence filled with grief, confusion, and the lingering impression that the darkness of the night had imprinted itself permanently upon those who survived. The night of horror would become the defining moment of Lady Morgana's life, the event that etched her name into the annals of history and folklore. It was not merely the act of murder itself that terrified people, but the combination of psychological manipulation, meticulous planning, and cold detachment that accompanied it. The forbidden feast had fulfilled its purpose: to shock, to terrify, and to leave an indelible mark on both the survivors and the larger world, ensuring that Lady Morgana's power, cunning, and darkness would be remembered long after the candles had burned out. In the aftermath of the banquet, the manor was a scene of grim fascination and whispered terror. News of the deaths spread quickly through the surrounding villages, carried first by frightened servants, then by travelers and couriers, until every corner of the region was consumed with curiosity and dread. Authorities arrived promptly, yet their efforts were met with obstacles at every turn. The halls, still echoing with the memory of the night's horrors, seemed to resist scrutiny. Candles flickered in the gloom as investigators combed the manor for evidence, but the meticulous design of the rooms, the hidden passageways, and the strategic placement of furniture complicated their work. Every corner offered both clues and confusion. What seemed a straightforward scene of violence quickly revealed itself as something carefully orchestrated. The investigators found themselves trapped in the same psychological web Lady Morgana had woven for her guests, confronted not only with physical evidence, but with an atmosphere thick with fear and uncertainty. Rumors proliferated faster than the authorities could investigate. Villagers spoke of unnatural occurrences, shadows that moved independently of their sources, cold drafts that seemed to emanate from the walls, and fleeting glimpses of figures vanishing into darkened corridors. Some claimed to have heard whispers in the night. Others insisted that strange lights had been seen in the windows of the manor long before the feast began. These stories, though impossible to verify, added to the growing mythos surrounding Lady Morgana, transforming her from an enigmatic hostess into a figure almost supernatural in her perceived power. Scholars, clergy, and social commentators debated the origins of the horror, blending accounts of human malice with speculation about curses, forbidden rituals, and the influence of forces beyond comprehension. The line between reality and legend blurred, and even those closest to the victims struggled to separate fact from speculation. The surviving servants and witnesses provided testimony, yet their accounts were riddled with contradictions. Fear, trauma, and the unreliability of memory made their statements fragmented and inconsistent. One servant described Lady Morgana moving through the halls with serene precision, while another recalled sudden bursts of fury and inexplicable laughter that seemed to echo through the empty corridors. Guests who had escaped the carnage offered their perspectives, revealing a night filled with subtle manipulations, sudden shocks, and inexplicable events that left them questioning not only the safety of the manor, but their own perception of reality. Every account, no matter how detailed, seemed to raise more questions than it answered, contributing to the growing sense that the horror was both deliberate and meticulously hidden within the very fabric of the manor itself. The authorities, constrained by the legal procedures of the time, struggled to establish motive and method. The manor's complexity, combined with Lady Morgana's carefully maintained social influence, rendered a straightforward investigation almost impossible. Forensic techniques were rudimentary, relying largely on observation, testimony, and rudimentary physical evidence. Yet, even these limited tools hinted at meticulous planning. The sequence of deaths suggested intentional placement, the manner of violence indicated forethought, and the psychological impact on the survivors implied a sophisticated understanding of fear. Scholars and early criminologists began to document the event, noting the unusual combination of premeditated physical violence and psychological manipulation. To them, Lady Morgana was not merely a murderer, but a master of human control, exploiting the vulnerabilities of her guests to create a scene of terror that transcended simple malice. The spread of rumor was aided by a society eager for sensational stories. Nobles discussed the event in salons, weaving speculative narratives around Lady Morgana's motivations, her possible alliances with occult practitioners, and the meaning behind the ritualistic elements observed in the hall. Artists and playwrights began sketching scenes inspired by the banquet, blending imagination and fact into depictions of horror that would be remembered for decades. Letters and diaries preserved the horror, ensuring that even those who were not present felt the weight of the event. Every retelling emphasized the cunning and composure of Lady Morgana, contrasting sharply with the panic and helplessness of her guests, heightening the dramatic impact and solidifying her reputation as a figure of both fascination and fear. The psychological impact on the region was profound. Fear permeated every social class. Commoners avoided the estate, Merchants hesitated to travel near its gates, and even nobles approached the manor with caution. Superstition mingled with fact, giving rise to tales of curses, spirits, and divine punishment. Lady Morgana's name became synonymous with mystery and dread, and the forbidden feast entered local lore as a cautionary tale of elegance turned deadly. The combination of physical evidence, survivor testimony, and persistent rumor created a potent narrative that would endure long after the immediate investigation concluded. The event had transcended mere crime to become a story of legend, demonstrating the profound influence that one carefully orchestrated act of horror could exert on both individuals and the collective consciousness. The arrest of Lady Morgana sent shockwaves through the aristocracy and the common folk alike, a ripple that shattered the illusion of untouchable power she had cultivated for so long. On the morning following the banquet, mounted guards arrived at the manor, their presence announcing that even the most influential figures were not beyond the reach of the law. Lady Morgana, dressed impeccably as always, received them with an air of calm detachment, her composure unbroken, as if she were merely entertaining visitors rather than confronting the consequences of unspeakable acts. Her servants and the few surviving guests watched in a mixture of awe and terror, unsure whether to pity, fear, or admire the woman who had orchestrated the night of horror. The very act of her arrest was laden with symbolism. The mighty, the enigmatic, and the terrifying brought low by the institutions of society, her fall a stark contrast to the power she had wielded with precision and cruelty. The journey from the manor to the local courthouse was a spectacle in itself. Crowds gathered along the streets, their murmurs and gasps echoing off the stone facades of neighboring buildings. Some whispered accusations, others offered prayers or curses, and many simply stared in disbelief at the figure who had haunted their imaginations for months. Lady Morgana maintained her poise, acknowledging none of the stares or murmurs, her eyes fixed forward, her mind seemingly calculating each step, each moment of public exposure. The contrast between the hysteria of the crowd and her serene composure heightened the drama, underscoring the psychological mastery she had displayed throughout her life. To the public, she was both the villain of a real tragedy and a figure of mesmerizing intrigue, a duality that ensured the story would not fade with time. Court proceedings were meticulously chronicled, capturing every glance, word, and gesture. The charges were severe: premeditated murder, psychological manipulation, and abuse of power. Witnesses testified to the horror they had endured, each recounting the terror of the banquet and the precision with which Lady Morgana had orchestrated the deaths. Some recounted whispers of her strange habits prior to the feast, subtle threats veiled as conversation, and moments of calculated observation that made guests question their safety and their own perceptions. Experts, scholars, and local authorities debated the extent of her premeditation, weighing evidence that combined physical proof with psychological insight. The trial became a theater of human emotion and intellect, a stage upon which Lady Morgana's brilliance and malevolence were dissected in equal measure. Public fascination with the trial reached fever pitch. Nobles, merchants, and ordinary citizens attended in large numbers, eager to witness the unraveling of a woman who had seemed untouchable. Every appearance, every statement, every slight inflection in Lady Morgana's voice was analyzed, magnified, and reported. Artists sketched her likeness, playwrights dramatized the proceedings, and writers of sensational pamphlets ensured that no detail went unnoticed. The courtroom itself seemed to mirror the manor, a stage where control and observation were central, and Lady Morgana, even within the strictures of legal authority, appeared to retain a subtle power over her audience. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the emotional turbulence of witnesses and observers, reinforcing the notion that she had always been several steps ahead, orchestrating perception as masterfully as she had orchestrated the feast itself. Psychological analyses during the trial speculated on her motives. Some argued that greed and desire for dominance had driven her actions. Others suggested deeper, more sinister compulsions, perhaps rooted in years of manipulation, isolation, and a fascination with fear itself. Scholars debated whether she was a coldly calculating sociopath or a brilliant strategist whose actions had escalated beyond moral comprehension. Testimonies revealed a woman capable of charm, persuasion, and calculated cruelty in equal measure, blurring the lines between villainy and genius. Every element of the trial reinforced the complex duality of Lady Morgana's persona: the enchanting hostess, the calculating manipulator, and the orchestrator of an unforgettable horror. The verdict, when it came, carried the weight of societal justice and public expectation. Lady Morgana's fall from grace was complete, yet her legend was cemented in the same breath. The sentence reflected both the severity of her crimes and the shock they had inflicted upon society, ensuring that the story of the Forbidden Feast would resonate for generations. Even as she was escorted from the courthouse, whispers followed her, tales of composure in the face of judgment, of cold intellect and unwavering control, of a woman who had defied conventions of morality and power. The trial had not merely adjudicated guilt. It had transformed Lady Morgana into a symbol of the terrifying potential of human cunning, ambition, and darkness. Her arrest and subsequent trial became more than legal events. They were cultural phenomena, examined and retold by those eager to understand how one individual could orchestrate such calculated terror. Society, while condemning her actions, could not resist fascination with the mind that had conceived and executed the Forbidden Feast. Every account of the trial served to magnify her legend, intertwining justice, horror, and psychological intrigue into a narrative that would endure long after the courtrooms emptied and the manor grew silent. Lady Morgana's fall was absolute, yet the imprint of her presence, her intelligence, cruelty, and ability to manipulate the human psyche remained indelibly etched into the collective memory, a cautionary tale of elegance, power, and unthinkable darkness. The manor, once a symbol of wealth and sophistication, became a relic of fear and fascination in the decades that followed. Its walls, steeped in the memories of that fateful night, seemed to retain the whispers of the guests who had perished, the terror that had rippled through the hall, and the cold, calculating presence of Lady Morgana herself. Locals avoided the estate, claiming that strange lights flickered in the windows at odd hours, and that shadows moved where no human foot could tread. Travelers passing by often reported a sense of being watched, a chill that settled deep into the bones, and an overwhelming feeling of unease that could not be explained by the cold stone or the wind through the trees. The manor had transformed from a residence of prestige into a monument of horror, its reputation cemented by stories passed from generation to generation. Legends grew around Lady Morgana and her Forbidden Feast. Some claimed that her spirit roamed the corridors, still observing those who dared to enter, her eyes as piercing and calculating as they had been in life. Others suggested that the manor itself was cursed, that the night of horror had imbued it with a malevolent energy that lingered in the shadows, waiting to ensnare the curious or the greedy. Folktales and whispered stories intertwined with historical accounts, creating a narrative that blurred the line between reality and myth. Parents warned their children never to wander near the estate, while writers and storytellers used the story as inspiration for dark tales, each version emphasizing the cunning and cruelty of the hostess, and the terrifying inevitability of the events that had unfolded during the banquet. Historians later studied the Forbidden Feast as a unique case in the intersection of power, psychology, and social influence. Lady Morgana had not merely committed acts of violence. She had orchestrated a complex web of manipulation, exploiting human behavior, social hierarchy, and fear itself to achieve her ends. Scholars noted her understanding of observation, control, and the subtle play of dominance, interpreting her actions as an early demonstration of psychological strategy in a context where legal and social consequences were limited only by perception and influence. Her methods revealed an almost preternatural understanding of human nature, a chilling reminder of how intellect and cruelty could be combined to devastating effect. Cultural fascination with Lady Morgana persisted long after her trial. Artists recreated scenes from the banquet, emphasizing candlelit hallways, the interplay of light and shadow, and the expressions of terror frozen on the faces of her guests. Plays and poems depicted the manor as both a stage and a trap, highlighting the theatricality of the horror and the brilliance of the hostess's orchestration. Even centuries later, writers and filmmakers found inspiration in the story, using it as a template for narratives that combined psychological tension, historical authenticity, and shocking revelation. The legend of Lady Morgana became more than a cautionary tale. It evolved into a symbol of the seductive danger of power and intellect divorced from morality. The psychological impact of the Forbidden Feast was also profound. Generations of local residents internalized the story as a warning of the unpredictability of human behavior, the vulnerability of even the most refined social circles, and the consequences of unchecked ambition and cunning. The manor became a locus of fear and curiosity, a place where history, memory, and imagination converged to form an enduring narrative. Scholars examining the event noted that the fascination was not solely with the violence itself, but with the orchestration, the planning, and the subtle manipulation that had led to the tragedy. Lady Morgana had demonstrated that terror could be as much a product of the mind as of action, leaving an enduring lesson in the potency of psychological influence. Visitors who came decades later to study or explore the estate often reported similar feelings of unease, as though the weight of history and the echoes of fear lingered in the air. Some claimed to experience fleeting visions of the banquet hall, glimpses of shadowed figures, or the sensation of being observed by an unseen presence. Whether these were manifestations of the imagination or remnants of the events themselves, they reinforced the idea that Lady Morgana's influence extended beyond her lifetime. Her presence imprinted on the environment she had so meticulously controlled. The manor remained a cautionary testament to the dark allure of power, intellect, and cruelty intertwined. Ultimately, the legacy of Lady Morgana and her Forbidden Feast was one of both fascination and horror. The story endured not only because of the shocking events of the night itself, but because it revealed the depth of human cunning, the vulnerability of societal structures, and the potent combination of intellect and malice. The manor, the tales, and the memories became intertwined, forming a chilling narrative that would be told, retold, and adapted through generations, ensuring that the memory of the Forbidden Feast and of Lady Morgana herself would never be forgotten. The events served as a reminder of the fragile veneer of civility and the ease with which it could be shattered, leaving behind only fear, legend, and the lingering echo of candles flickering against stone walls where shadows never ceased to move.